to a new episode of the Shoegazing podcast. I'm Jesper Ingevaldsson of shoegazing.com, one of the largest sites in the world on quality footwear. For this episode, I met up with the Australian-born, UK-based shoemaker Sebastian Tarek. Apart from running his own bespoke shoe brand and doing outwork for various London-based bespoke shoemakers, he has also for many years been involved in teaching shoemaking, both at colleges and in other ways, and is highly engaged in the topic of education. With focus on the UK, but also looking at it at a wider perspective, we talk about how the ways to become a shoemaker has changed through the years, what the possibilities are today for those who want to learn to make shoes by hand, and what needs to be done to preserve and develop shoemaking education in the future, among other things. So enjoy your listen. All right, Sebastian Tarek, welcome to the Shoegazing podcast.
Thanks, Jesper. Nice to see you.
Yeah, nice to be in your workshop here in pretty close to Liverpool Street in London here.
We call it the Spitalfields area because of the market directly opposite, which was historically the grocery market of London.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, and there's quite a few shoemakers and shoe shops and stuff around.
Historically, we are right on the edge of where, this is 300 years ago, this would have been called Shoreditch. Now it's probably a little bit more nebulous how you would title it. But Shoreditch all the way through to sort of the south bit of Hackney was the shoemaking area of London.
Yeah, cool. So we're going to talk about sort of education of new shoemakers. But as always, let's talk a bit about you first, so people get to know you if they don't already. By the way you talk, people probably know you're Australian by now, even if you lived there for a long time.
It's a soft accent now. It's a very soft accent, I like to think.
Maybe, but I think you don't fool too many people. But sort of, first of all, how and when did your journey in the shoe world begin?
It started, roughly speaking, end of 1994 when I was over here on a sports tour. Bombing out of high school quite badly. I was over here on a high school sports tour, and I had decided I wasn't going to go back to Australia necessarily, that I might stay here and look for work, as my mother was originally from London. And on Christmas Day, I was at my uncle and aunt's place watching crappy Christmas Day television, and the Danny Kaye film Hans Christian Andersen came on, and I thought, that looks like a nice life. I'm going to roam the countryside, telling stories, making shoes. So I went back to Australia, attempt to finish high school unsuccessfully, but enrolled in an evening class in footwear.
Okay.
I was very, very lucky that the TAFE system in Australia is sort of almost like a technical college kind of scenario. You would go there and do qualifications potentially as a hairdresser or a butcher, but they also had sort of a lot of like vocational and sort of more hands-on skills-based courses. And one close enough to me happened to have a footwear course.
Yeah, cool.
So
where in Australia?
Sydney.
Okay.
Sydney. That college is still there. They no longer do the footwear course. Now I think there's only one TAFE college in Australia that does footwear, and that's in Adelaide. Which is, I think, the Tim Scrime kind of connection. So I did a couple of years of part-time courses through that, and decided that I would move to England and enroll at Cordwainers and do a degree in footwear.
Yeah.
And when I came over here, I realized that despite having a British passport, I needed to get my residency in order to be able to study as a local student. So I did a bunch of part-time courses at Cordwainers, which was still on Mare Street in Hackney, and intended to do the degree or the HND at the end of that 3-year period, but went back to Australia for a quick holiday just before my interview and fell in love with Australia again.
All right.
So I came over, I did my interview, I tanked it completely, went back to Australia and wasn't really sure if I was going to continue pursuit in footwear. But because I've been running bars and clubs over here and working in pretty high standard hospitality, I could get a really well paid bar job in a country that pays hospitality properly.
Yeah.
and therefore had enough time to devote to trying to just suss things out with shoes. I managed to get myself a job with a shoemaker in Sydney named Andrew McDonald, who was probably one of, roughly speaking, 2 shoemakers in Sydney kind of really at that time. Made quite edgy kind of conceptual footwear almost. Yeah. But he had been a Churchill Fellowship award holder. So he'd come over here and spent several years studying with different shoemakers, but ranging from Paul Harnden when he was still up in Perthshire to Lobb's Outworker. So I worked for him for a couple of years.
And you not as an apprentice, but as you got paid or in between?
Yeah, in between is a perfect way to describe it. At times I got paid, at times I didn't. We did sort of very fashionable footwear, if you like. And he had a bespoke service, but it was still using a stock last, a mending lasts. Very rarely was it hand welted. It would usually still be kind of like a mock welt construction with a Blake stitch or something like that. But probably what I learned from that was how to try and make shoes in an equitable time frame. There was no mucking about. I was expected to make 6 pairs of ladies' boots with high heels, pulled over toes, heels, get the heels drilled on in a day. And so it kind of gave me a taste for what working as a shoemaker was rather than playing around with shoemaking a bit. So after a while I left him, I started to do a little bit of kind of fashion week stuff. I did a couple of collections for people on their runway presentations. And I did a season for the Opera Company in Australia, which was challenging to say the least.
Yeah.
Making kind of period reproduction footwear. And I think it's very difficult to understand how poor the resources for shoemaking were in Australia at the time. It's pre-meaningful internet age. There was one leather merchant, maybe a couple of sort of very small tanneries knocking around, getting equipment. There was a last manufacturer in Melbourne, but if you wanted to buy last from him, you had to buy a factory set.
So the shoemaking industry literally sort of had left the country.
I think it's still technically considered a dead industry because I think by Australian standards, you need some form of union representation in order for it to be considered an ongoing principle. And there's some shoemaking there, but predominantly it's R.M. Williams. Now I think it's one of the more interesting times in shoemaking in Australia. There's a few people there doing interesting things, but they really have to kind of scour the world for what they want to use. So after I'd sort of spent, I think I was back in Australia for 3 years, I was really committed to shoemaking as the business that I wanted to work in and the craft that I wanted to pursue. And so I decided that I'd come back to England for a year or two. I'd saved up a bit of money and try and find a way of sort of finishing, or kind of like developing and sort of like feeling comfortable where I was at. My family worked in fashion media at the time. So I felt pretty confident that I'd be able to go back to Australia and sort of start up a business and sort of be quite comfortable and satisfied with it. But probably within about a year or two of being back, I realized I didn't want to go back to Australia. My first job in shoemaking over here was for Georgina Goodman, who at the time was predominantly a couturier making really, really interesting, beautiful, very sculptural women's shoes. And I joined with her when she launched her ready-to-wear collection. So I stayed with her for a little while doing some of the kind of front-of-house marketing kind of stuff and working in the workshop, sort of making these entirely hand-stitched, beautiful veg tan, very sculptural shoes. She ultimately became Alexander McQueen's designer and is now running the footwear course at London College of Fashion. And there I met Dominic Casey.
Yeah, okay.
And Dom's been just a huge part of my development and career ever since. I mean, it feels trite to refer to him as a mentor because he's just a dear, 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 dear friend first and foremost.
And for those who don't know, he used to be at Cleverly. Now he runs his own business, so to speak.
This was before he was at Cleverly's. So at this point, he was just with George. He was teaching at the Royal College of Arts. And I think he was doing freelance work for people in a lot of different kind of capacities. When I left George, he told me that he thought there was something going at James Tanner & Son. So I went there, spent nearly the next 4 years working in-house there. And that's where I picked up welting and became a bottom maker. Went freelance from there. At the time, I was sharing my studio with Benjamin Clayman's son, Leonard.
Which year was this roughly?
So I think I would have started at Taylor's probably about 2004, maybe 2005, something like that. And at the end of the period of my working in-house, Leonard was renting a space in the basement at Taylor's. I wanted to find a space of his own. I was thinking about going freelance. So we took a place together at the end of Columbia Road and shared that for the next 2 years before he went back to Germany. And during that 2-year period, while I was working just freelance as an outworker for Taylor's, he had started working for Cleverly's doing all of the long soling.
Mm-hmm.
So through Leonard, I kind of had an opportunity to sort of explore more in the West End initially, and I went on to do a lot more freelance work from that point onwards. And then after maybe 3 or 4 years of just doing that, somebody from a fashion incubator over here called Fashion East approached me and offered me a stand on schedule at London Fashion Week for the next 3 seasons. And that's sort of how I started my business.
Yeah.
At that point, I'd been sort of taking on sort of orders, but like in very big inverted commas orders, like opportunities to explore my crafts where I could kind of make enough money to kind of cover some of the costs. But really, they were developmental kind of opportunities.
So you, before that, sort of, you were mainly like outwork bottom maker?
Yes.
For like Western firms?
Yes. And I've never stopped doing that.
No, exactly.
Which is probably the reason why I have to sort of stop short of describing exactly one that I have or do work for. Is, you know, my generation was very much, if you're doing your own thing, then you don't advertise who you work for. It was just a matter of discretion and politeness to the employer. And I love still doing outwork. If my business was big enough, I think I would still make sure that I continue to do outwork, because it's an opportunity to develop my craft in a way that my own work doesn't really deal with as much. You know, I've been working in the West End for over 20 years now, and there have been really meaningful, if subtle, evolutions in what West End shoes look like. It's a great way to have a perception from what trends are evolving. At one point, I probably was doing a little bit of work for all of the remaining members of the West End Master Bootmakers Association. So you see a lot of different styles, and obviously, I mean, I'm sure, you know, a lot of people who read and listen to this would know that traditionally in London's West End, when you do a bottoming job, you get given a client at the beginning of their relationship with the firm, and then you continue to do that client's work forever. So you're allowed to have your own signature, if you like, but you always have to follow the house style. And, you know, I can think of sort of probably 2 West End firms who would do a similar style of shoe, where you just had to remember the very specific differences in how they expressed, you know, a subtle sort of squarish toe shape kind of thing. You know, it's fascinating. It keeps somebody who makes, I mean, I do a lot of shoemaking. It really does keep you on your toes, so to speak, when you have to think about these things.
Yeah, and I mean, especially when you're sort of starting up a new independent shoe brand as a shoemaker, the fact that you have a sort of base line of work, doing outwork, is making it possible for many, so to speak. I think a lot of the sort of small shoe brands in the UK, but also other parts of the world, the shoemakers work that way, and that's what makes it possible for them to sort of continue with their sometimes smaller scale own brand, so to speak.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think you know, at the judging panel, there's always a few interesting conversations with people who come from different footwear backgrounds. And yeah, the UK setup is quite unique and really does allow the flexibility, if you like.
Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
I can do a pair for somebody 1 week and then spend the rest of the week working on my own kind of work if I want to, kind of thing. There really is a lot of opportunity to kind of dovetail things together.
Yeah, and you, like you say, you can, when you have a lot of work with your own business, you can sort of be more focused on that and say no to freelance work for a while, maybe, and then the other way around if it. So flexibility in that way.
Yeah, it's also, my house style is quite distinct. And I would be lying if I said I thought it was the most accessible thing for the global bespoke footwear consumer. So, I don't necessarily do a huge amount of work at times. Most of my work is based in Japan and now the US. So there are peaks and troughs. So it's really great to be able to fill that in. I've spent probably the last 15 years or so intermittently working in different educational situations. So, it's, again, you can kind of like fit it together. It's I consider myself incredibly fortunate in that regard.
How would you describe your own sort of style, the Sebastian Tarek brand?
I got a real earful from somebody on a trip a little while ago when I was asked that question and really struggled to answer it, because to me, the footwear is fairly self-evidently distinct and a bit different kind of thing. But yeah, sometimes you have to say it out loud. Yeah. So I've been thinking about this a bit recently. I suppose the distinction I consider for myself is I try and make bespoke shoes for people who want a modern wardrobe. I think we live in an age in which there's a lot of character creation for how men dress. And I really want to make shoes less for a niche or a character, if you like, and more just for people who want to dress in a modern way. Yeah. They're less likely to think of themselves as an archetype necessarily. So modern wardrobe, aesthetically, I'm a bit of an arch minimalist. So I eschew kind of needless details. Quarter lines tend to be quite straight rather than curved, unless they have to be curved. I've done a lot of what I would still call a hole cut, but where there's a back seam kind of thing for a long time. And I try and only work with UK tanneries for my uppers. Yeah. So that set of parameters really does help define the characteristic of my work, because as a result, I work with a lot of veg tan tanneries. Yeah. I make a lot of shoes out of kudu these days, and most of the leathers that I work with tend to have a lot of character.
Yeah, they are, and this sort of, if I describe it, it's a bit more like it's casual rugged style of handmade shoemaking, and also, design stuff that you don't necessarily see on, especially if you look at the Western firms and that type of thing.
Yeah, the idea was always to make a bit of a unique kind of silhouette and texture, but with quite classical West End details. And yeah, the truth is the majority of my customers don't buy their shoes necessarily to wear with suits.
No.
A lot of people who need to go to work and look a particular way, but that doesn't necessarily require them to wear a suit and shirt and tie kind of thing.
Yeah. And you do for your own brand, you do the whole process yourself, which isn't that common here in the UK among bespoke shoemakers. So why do you do this?
The short answer is ignorance. I remember going for an interview at Lobs when I first came over here and talking to somebody there about sort of what my intention was. And he just looked at me like, you've clearly never read a book about shoemaking. I was under the impression that shoemakers made shoes. Yeah. So it was only kind of that entry into the West End that you realized how much roles were siloed and exploded. And, I work as a bottom maker, a big chunk of my working life. I really love the opportunity to do the whole thing. But also I think increasingly in sort of the epoch of independent shoemakers, you get a lot of clients who are really interested in interacting with the shoemaker. And that can be varying degrees of how much you do the job yourself. But personally, I think I find it much more rewarding. Yeah. Bottom line. And B, I think a lot of the clients really appreciate that when they talk to me about a detail,
I am the person who is executing that detail. There is no translation for things to be lost in, and they get a real sense of the intimacy of the process. I mean, also, I now kind of, when I do fittings, that's a week-long job for me. So I come into work on a Monday and I make a pair of lasts, might bleed over into the Tuesday a little bit. I do my pattern making and my clicking on Tuesday. Wednesday, I close the upper. Thursday, I last it over. And on Friday, I stitch the welts. And I have an enormous sense of well-being from that being kind of like how I do my process. I don't think I would want to drop any of those stages out, even if I do find pattern making just brain-taxingly challenging.
Okay, so that's the most difficult part for you, so to speak.
Yes, yeah. I'm dyslexic, dysgraphic, and the sad thing is that pattern making, really simple pattern making, it's probably another reason why I make quite simple-looking styles.
Yeah, okay.
I find it's, I need to go and like point my face in the corner of a wall and rock backwards and forwards after I've made patterns for a day. It's just, it's really challenging.
Yeah, interesting. But you still want to continue doing it.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think all craft, particularly shoemaking, you have to be interested in challenging yourself on a regular basis. Yeah. Otherwise, your standards of work slip in all aspects of it.
Cool. All right. And you mentioned it a bit, but since a while back, you've been also involved in training and educating new shoemakers in various ways. How did this start for you?
I think the first place I worked was a very small private college called Prescott and Mackay that was on Warren Street. And they did a series of different crafts workshops that you could book in, you could have regular access or you could do sort of like a fixed period one. And I did I think I started off with like an introduction to bespoke shoemaking techniques class there. And it'd be for small numbers, just for enthusiasts really, more than actual sort of dedicated shoemakers. And then after I'd done that for a couple of years, Dom needed some help at the Royal College of Arts. So I worked there for about 7 years. And while that wasn't really training shoemakers, it was working on a postgraduate footwear design course. Okay. Yeah. It was amazing. You are being asked to help students realize just completely incomprehensible, baffling, very new materials and new techniques kind of processes. So I loved doing that. We all left at the same time from there. And
when was this?
I think we must have left there about 6 years ago.
6 years ago, yeah.
That's another institution which has kind of gone through quite a big evolution since then.
Yeah.
I left Capel Manor quite recently, like I think maybe last year. I spent 3 years, so sort of from the tail end of lockdown until about a year or so ago, working on a 1-year foundation in footwear course. And that was a very interesting place to me because Capel Manor was where the saddlery course went to when London College of Fashion took over Cordwainers and didn't want to take all their courses with them. Okay. So while it's predominantly a land-based studies local college, at the time they had equine studies. So saddlery seemed to fit there. And Lena, who ran that course and had brought it over, was really dear friends with Sue Saunders, who's a bit of a titan and legend of footwear design education. She passed away a few years ago. So she set that course up must be about 8 years ago or so now. So for me, it was a real honor to take on part of her legacy and honor that. But also I thought it was really, really fabulous that there was a foundation level course with a qualification, which means that a student can apply for a student loan and everybody gets a student loan. Yeah. So it's you take on debt, true, but you can spread that out with repayments only after you start to earn a certain amount of money. So at a time when the footwear industry and its training seemed to be moving into a place where you needed economic means to become a shoemaker, it felt like an opportunity to try and correct that a little bit. The complication with that is that education in the United Kingdom is a hot mess. So in order to maintain a qualification and therefore be eligible for state funding and student loans, you have to fulfill certain requirements, and not just from a scholastic point of view.
but you need to have enough students who ultimately graduate to make up relevant numbers.
Yeah.
So when we were running a apprenticeship foundation course, which means it was applicable for 16-year-olds and up, that pathway didn't have the necessary amount of graduates. So we needed to re-qualify the course. So Lena and I wrote a qualification. We found an awarding body that was prepared to do it. And it's now an access to higher education course. It still teaches, I think, the majority of the things that we were doing then, but it probably now is in a bit of a space where we shoehorned a course into a qualification to maintain its survival, but we knew what our objectives were, and they were teaching people shoemaking, whereas now I think its objectives are slightly more fulfilling what the qualification is, and it's a little bit more focused on getting people into higher education.
Okay.
But that course, you made 5 pairs of shoes and it ended up with a full welted pair of shoes.
You still learn proper shoemaking?
It's a shoemaking course. It absolutely is.
And you still work with this?
No, sadly, actually, I had to leave about a year ago because I'd recommenced my traveling schedule.
All right, yeah.
And I found myself leaving school on a Wednesday afternoon, sleeping at Heathrow, flying to Tokyo the next day, and then coming back Monday night and going back to school. And it's it was unsustainable. I probably hoped that I would stay on there in some capacity, but the schools decided to kind of move on into a different direction, and they now have to try and work out their staffing. So they've got somebody that works across saddlery and footwear now. So it's probably a little less specialist than when it was when I was there, but there's still definitely merit in it. I did a bit of teaching for James and Deborah at Carrie Ducker at the start of the year when James broke his wrist. Is there anything else I've done? I feel like there's something I'm missing and I can't think of what it is. But yeah, I've done quite a bit of stuff.
Different types of stuff. And also everything from sort of proper making to design and
Yes. Yeah. I think my real passion lies in public education. As I said before, I think I was really struck listening to some of your previous shows. I listened to Jim McCormack's and then Will Laborde's programs.
Yeah.
And I thought it was really conspicuous that, in Jim's period of time, you didn't necessarily need to have studied anything. You could get effectively an apprenticeship and you would have a training pathway that was secure with the prospect of solid employment or freelance work afterwards. And then you kind of fast forward 35 years to someone like Will, who's basically his route into shoemaking has been paid for private tuition. He's a graduate of Carrie Ducker and then, was lucky enough to have a period of time with Jim McCormack. And it's apples and oranges. Like it's night and day. And I think the industry is at a very curious place where, it seems like you need to have the financial means behind you to become a shoemaker. Whereas, historically, shoemaking was the job that your maybe not very bright son was sent off to do because they couldn't do anything else, kind of thing. And I think we have a very different ecology of shoemakers as a result, but I really fear that shoemaking is becoming, like a lot of aspects of culture in this country, only available for those with the economic means to start it in the first place.
Yeah, maybe we should go into that sort of straight away and first look at it sort of historically a bit, because like you mentioned, a lot has changed, and if we focus on England in this case, since it's one of the main markets for this, and this is what you know most about, could you sort of briefly go through how the educational process of new makers has developed up until today? If you sort of give an overview.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always difficult when you're deeply involved in something to be able to really step back. Yeah. And I am no historian. Actually, interestingly, I know Deborah Caro is in the process of doing a PhD on sort of like the industry in a much more macro historical point of view, which I'm sure is going to be fascinating when it comes out. But I suppose strange enough, I met up with an old colleague from James Taylor & Son 2 weeks ago, and she referred to us as being part of a strange lost generation.
that was, you didn't really have much opportunity to have that more long-term invested apprenticeship style kind of like relationship to an employer. And Carrie Tucker hadn't started. So there wasn't really the opportunities for education, for private tuition. But what I had during my developmental period was proximity to both in a way. So my understanding was that that older generation would go and work for a shoemaking firm, and they would have some role which made the firm feel like they were getting something out of your presence there, while they were able to gauge what acumen you had and where your interests lay.
Yeah.
Before you would, after a certain amount of time, go and spend a proportion of your working week with the relevant outworker for the skill that you were going to go into. So I think Dom told me he spent a year going maybe 2 or 3 days a week with, I think he was a bottom maker. No, he might have been a pattern maker first, actually, Dom, and did that. And then you would go and work at the firm the rest of the time. And there was an understanding with the firm that because they had trained the person in question, they were somewhat obliged. I don't know if there was remuneration involved with that, if I'm perfectly honest. But then after you'd done that, you would be expected to do a minimum of 5 years for the firm that had trained you up as an outworker, potentially doing things at a slightly lower rate. So, for instance, when I left Taylor's, I continued to do piecework for them at like £5 or £10 per pair less than what I would charge somebody else because of it was how
that's sort of how you pay them back for your education in a way.
It was. I mean, the irony being that, you know, I when I managed to convince Mr. Schweiger that I wanted to become a welted bottomer, he sent me off to Dom actually 4 times. So I had 4 individual days where I learned how to prep an insole, stitch a welt, prep the filler, stitch the sole, and I vaguely knew how to build a heel. And somewhere I still have the scrap of paper where Dom said, "I'm really sorry, but we don't have time to teach you how to finish the heels. Here's the various stages of finishing." So the things had already changed quite dramatically by that point. But yeah, that's what you did. During my time, and Louise, who's now based in New Zealand, actually, you might be able to snatch the attention of your employer enough to send you off for little pockets of learning, but you wouldn't necessarily get quite such a continuous thing. That was my particular experience. I think some firms, I think Lobs probably has a more rich tradition and ongoing ecology of how they manage the development of their workforce. Interestingly enough, at the moment, I think they have a whole bunch of roles they're advertising for.
Exactly. Yeah. I saw that. And I mean, people might not really think that so much about that, but a firm like Lobs, with the size and everything, there is a lot of sort of the UK shoemaking industry that goes through Lobs in some way or another, if you look at it through the years, so to speak, also nowadays.
Yeah. I mean, I think Lob's relationship to the broader industry has always been a little bit particular from all of the other firms.
Yeah.
I mean, I can think of firms who probably have never trained a single person kind of thing. Their attitude was always, we can provide you with enough work, you come to us as the finished article kind of thing. I mean, there's one firm that I did a lot of outwork for where I was sort of at a bit of a transitionary phase where I was like developing bottom maker, and I basically did long soles for them for 3 years before I even looked at a new shoe. And the workshop manager at that time was invested in me becoming better at it. So he would kind of give me a bit of information. He would critique my work constructively kind of thing. But still, at the end of the day, I was getting paid as a piece worker. So I think that's where the industry, sort of broadly speaking, lies these days. You know, you might get a bit of feedback, but you're not likely to get a lot of development unless you go somewhere. And I think at this point, it's Lobs or bust. I'm not sure whether or not anybody else does take people on as an employee, where if they have a role going, then they will invest the time in developing you to have the necessary expertise. Yeah. But I think these days, more and more shoemakers do it the other way. You know, you start with something like a Carrie Tucker course, and then, you know, you kind of work yourself and maybe
I mean, the internet changed everything, right?
Yeah.
And strangely enough, I think almost Instagram changed it even more than the internet, because I remember going to what probably was the first of the West End shoemakers drinks, where firms would occasionally have a piss up. And other firms might turn up to varying degrees. And if you're lucky, there'd be an owner of a firm that had a pocket full of 20s, and we would all get roaringly drunk and we would chat. Whereas I think it was Dom and Dave McKee who organised the first, if you like, independent of a firm drinks. And they said that they had known of each other since the very early 80s and had never met each other. And that Instagram was the thing that gave them the introduction.
Yeah, cool.
And so now I think there's just much more kind of transference of information. You get people who learn how to make shoes from the internet.
Yeah, exactly. I met a number of people who sort of, even if they've often get it from various other parts as well, but where the main thing is, looking at maybe shoegazing articles and YouTube videos and stuff like that, and having that as your main tutors.
Which just blows my mind.
Yes.
I mean, I think about how many small details that still I'm convinced when I'm teaching a group of, say, 6 students go like, oh, this is a bit too big an audience. I wish there was just 2 of you. Kind of thing. And then you think there's somebody learning how to attach a thread that they've made onto a bristle via YouTube. Like, how?
Must be so much trial and error.
I mean, I met a shoemaker in Australia once who said that when he started, he'd misunderstood what was being displayed, and the fishing line, which obviously you make your bristles out of, he was using for his thread.
That's lovely.
So he was making welted shoes with really heavyweight fishing line and wearing these really heavy gardening gloves to wrap around his hands,
if you want to pull
not to lacerate his hands.
Jesus Christ.
But that's, I mean, what are you going to do in Australia? You know, you don't have a lot of opportunity. So, now I think things have changed quite a bit, how people learn. But there's no substitute for somebody being sat with you. And it might be in a group situation, or it might be just 2 people making shoes in the same room where you can ask somebody a question. I mean, I've done quite a bit of shoemaking down at Dom's place over the years, and he might be making uppers and I'm sat in his really awkwardly hyped chair with weird armrests that he thinks is the only way you can make shoes. But having somebody there that you can just ask a question.
Yeah.
I mean, I shared a studio with a bootmaker named Felix Joano for, must have been about 6 or 7 years. And for the first 2 years, I don't reckon 10 minutes would pass without him asking me a question. And it'd be things that he knew the answer to. Yeah. But you just take solace that there's somebody else who does it maybe the same way or maybe slightly different way. And it confirms what you've hoped you were doing right all along. Because with shoes, it's quite difficult. You finish a pair of shoes, somebody wears them, and then to a greater or lesser extent, they go off into the ether and you have no idea how they've worked. So it's very difficult to confirm suspicions with shoemaking. That's why I think, look, you can make the most beautiful looking shoes in the world, but until you've been doing it for 10 years, there's probably very little to base the assumption that it's really working out well.
Now we mentioned a few of the things, but for those who want to become shoemakers today, which are the main options, would you say?
That's actually still, I did quite a bit of research for this. I've spoken to a lot of people in the last week, and I'm still struggling to say what the answer to that is. I had a lovely little chat with Seiji McCarthy after listening to his, I think it was his Stitch Down episode about his experience. And he's probably 10 years after me. So he was into that private tuition era of it. And, obviously he's making exquisite shoes, So realistically, in terms of formal education in the United Kingdom at the moment, if you had your heart set on becoming a shoemaker and you wanted it to be qualified, so to speak, through the UK education sector, what you'd do was you'd go to Capel Manor, you'd do a 1-year foundation course. Then you would go, in all honesty, these days, you would have to go to De Montfort University in Leicester.
which I think is probably the most slept on institution in the country, if I'm honest. Of all the public institutions, I think where their focus lays for a shoemaker is the most explicit. And if you think about some of the people that they've had involved in their course, you get some really specific information. I was asked to go and judge on the panel for their second year prize a few years ago. And like the finishing wasn't great, but the depth of understanding of shoemaking that these students had was really impressive. They have in their second year bespoke module, and that's you either do classic bespoke or you do orthopedic bespoke. So you can learn more about the anatomy, and Bill Bird was really involved in both the creation, I think, of that module and sort of some of the ongoing. Tony Slingers delivered that course. Adele Williamson from Trickers is now involved in that course. Like they're some great people. In theory, you could have gone, or you still can go to either University of Northampton or London College of Fashion. And London College of Fashion took over the Cordwainers name, if you like, if not really the courses. They left all of the diploma level courses at the creation of the LCF Cordwainers program. So you can do a BA or an MA there. And as was announced very recently, the BA is going to stop being a footwear course as of next year. They've just recently started to talk about the fact that it's going to be a composite footwear accessories course. That's much more design focused, but the rumblings I'm hearing is that they actually want to probably grapple with crafts at a bit more of a detailed level. Okay. So while it will be a design course, you know, the people who are involved in that course now were students in the 90s. They know how much is to be gained as a designer by learning about shoemaking and about crafts.
The basics, so to speak.
So you can either do that, which ultimately gets you a BA, and then how much that helps you get work kind of is probably very dependent on the student. You know, Adele's a graduate of DMU and she went to Trickers afterwards. I believe she's a Quest scholar. So she would have had some support in terms of the financial aspect of going into a pursuit of craft excellence environment, which is what Quest's agenda is. And probably, if I'm honest, these days, if you want to go into an employment opportunity where there wasn't something that you could just do as an apprentice level kind of thing, chances are you are going to have to get a Quest grant or a Heritage Crafts grant to help with the financial support of that, because a lot of employers will be taking people on in that situation less because they're concerned about the development of their own workforce and more because they're compelled to continue the craft to a certain degree. So it's a bit of an awkward situation to try and assess, if I'm honest. The alternative is you go down the private route. Carrie Ducker probably started up about 20 years ago, I think. And I think they started predominantly because when LCF took over the Cordwainers program, they no longer ran the hand welting, or what James and Deborah referred to as hand sewn shoemaking evening class, which James was delivering. So they kind of filled that gap. And now there are a lot of shoemakers' first entry into learning the more, if we like, traditional techniques of shoemaking. But they're very much a bottoming course. They do pat making as well, but that's more of a kind of like ad hoc course kind of thing. If you have an interest in lasts, you'd go down and see Steve Lowy at Last Maker House, which is the course that Dom and he set up initially. I actually did the beta testing of that before they'd launched it. It was a 2-day version, and even on the 2-day version, I was blown away by how useful that was. It's got great. It's probably one of the few courses knocking around at the moment, which is actually really for people who are looking to do a very specific skill. So the breadth of information you get is it's proper. It's really not necessarily, while there's hobbyists doing it, you need to be a very committed hobbyist to spending 4 days in that freezing cold workshop, busting a gut, making a pair of lasts by hand. So there's that. I mean, Jim McCormack obviously was doing a bit of training at one point for a few years. And I think
anybody that had access to that must have felt like they'd been touched by the hand of God. I don't think there's very many places to have tuition on the development stuff. Again, there are people who are having some sort of like tailored training things via programs like Quest and Heritage Crafts. But in terms of something which is sort of accessible, as in like anybody can theoretically pick up the phone and make it happen, there's not a lot of options there. So then you kind of rely on either, collegiate communication with other shoemakers, finding an entry point into a firm. There's still definitely a pretty meaningful gap between that kind of like, and Carrie Ducker aren't the only people that teach it. I know Mariano at one point was doing private classes. There might be some other people dotted around the country. But yeah, from that kind of like first core learning, and I think this is probably one of the reasons why a lot of people continue to do the Carrie Ducker stuff. It's an ongoing kind of annual training kind of thing.
Yeah.
I don't think there's really necessarily a lot of options for what you do afterwards to kind of bridge that gap into kind of employment.
Yeah, and you have, for those who sort of start from this beginning, so to speak, then Carrie Ducker is quite well known, also international, so to speak. And then you have like Schola Academy in Italy and those type of where people move to sort of live and be taught full time.
I think Shirokasi-san in Tokyo is doing a foreign language course as well, actually.
Yeah.
Which I think, again, that must be quite an amazing experience.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You have a few of those places where you also see that a lot of shoemakers come from through those places, so to speak. And it's sad from my point of view to see that they've only sort of, if you look at bespoke shoemaking, that France seems to be the only country in the world where you really still have this sort of proper whole educational system where that still sort of runs and really works well, so to speak.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of conversations with the industry at large about that subject, if you like. I think the demise of the LCF course has sort of probably got a few people thinking. I'm a regular attendee at the Independent Shoemakers Conference, which has been going for about 27 years now. Yeah. And that's, if there's two things you can be sure of are going to happen at that event, there's going to be the angry orthopedic half hour where everybody complains about NHS procurement and the state of orthopedic shoemaking and what are we going to do about the industry sort of thing. That organization it's entirely horizontal and it's completely collegiate. The very premise of it is that we're all here to share information. That has been an integral part of some shoemakers' development. That's how Will Powell, Nicholas Templeman's business partner, started. He attended a conference and probably about 10 o'clock at night at the bar with Dom Casey was like, I really want to become a shoemaker and I don't know how to do it. And Dom, with one pinky cocked on the end of his pint, would have gone, now pull up a chair and hear me out. But so there's a bit of that.
He's an upper maker, we should mention for those who don't know.
Of course.
He's specialized in one section, so to speak.
But, he's a damn good upper maker.
Yeah, exactly.
He really is. He really is.
So, but you can't really do that, so to speak. You can apparently start from bar round at the Independent Shoemakers Conference and get to where he is, so to speak.
Exactly. I think, ask any shoemaker what's essential to becoming a shoemaker and they will all say discipline, patience, determination, preparedness for hard work. So those things all still apply. But I think whereas maybe once historically anybody in theory could go off and become a shoemaker, now you're really going to have to navigate a complicated process to do so in all likelihood. But there's some interesting conversations going on. I think the Pattern Makers Guild have probably been a little bit more engaged with the subject of shoemaking and sort of like how to maintain its development more so maybe than the cordwainers, who are a bit more of a broad footwear guilds and very focused on education and footwear design. So they support the Bill Bird online orthopedic program, which is, again, by all accounts, an incredible program of online learning and very occasional in person about foot anatomy. So that's accessible, if you like. I think that those guys I've heard some rumblings that there is a conversation happening at the moment about whether or not there is any way to commence some sort of journeyman program.
Yeah.
Which parts of Europe, I mean, Sweden, definitely has a journeyman system. We had a lovely conversation with Corrine from Stockholm about that subject. So there's conversations about that.
Because that's what France do so well, that they have that sort of set up properly.
So, and there's enough shoemakers here probably, if there's a way of making that work, that it would be phenomenal. I think every shoemaker to a certain degree thinks of themselves as going through a sort of period of journeyman sort of status, if you like, trying to find as many shoemakers to work with. Curiously, since we first had a conversation about doing this talk, I was approached by somebody at the Saddlers Guild who's running the Warsaw Leather Skills Centre about the possibility of creating a program of footwear courses. It would be paid for short courses of varying different lengths and specialisms, but they have a very meaningful bursary program to try and help with the accessibility of that. And I think probably at the moment, as with a lot of things in the UK, shoemaking development is very London-centric.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that the heart of the shoemaking industry is the Midlands. So if there is a chance to develop something there, then hopefully that could, maybe kind of like help offset kind of some of these shortcomings that we've sort of talked about. And as I said, I think there's a really collegiate atmosphere amongst shoemakers. Something that I was really struck by at the end of Jim's interview with you was when talking about the explosion in indies, not to forget the firms. Yeah. And I think the truth is that the firms are the people who are likely to actually take shoemakers on and train them up. Yeah. I don't think many independent shoemakers are in a position where they really can.
No, exactly. That. Even if they would like to, it's not really possible in most cases, so to speak.
For all sorts of reasons. Even the really, really busy shoemakers, they're doing a lot of traveling to facilitate that. You don't necessarily have the scale or infrastructure to train somebody up. I think the footwear industry in this country is at an interesting point. And I'm really, really conscious that we are potentially staring at the precipice of a cliff edge on certain skills. Seeing the likes of Jim McCormack and Dom Casey, look, both those guys have hit retirement age.
Yeah, exactly.
And they're not alone. I mean, Bill Bird's well past retirement age. How do we preserve certain skills which undeniably benefit from in-person training when that generation who really did have more of a classical development and training kind of at the beginning of their careers, how do we kind of preserve that before it disappears completely?
How do you see the sort of publishing and either in book form or online form, YouTube, whatever, sort of the new material on shoemaking, that type of things. Before, you always had the big classic books, the volumes, and that was sort of how many learned shoemakers and how a lot of things passed on. But how do you see the passing on of the current skills, so to speak? And because things have developed from Golding's early 1900s stuff. And
we're very fortunate that publishing has become more accessible as well. You must have seen Hartmutt's the
Yeah, of course. It's a great book.
It's the definitive text of our generation, without a shadow of a doubt.
It's an upper-making book published in German first, and now in English.
With subsequent editions to come out.
Yeah, exactly. And he also, which I think is how you should do it now. If you publish a book, but you also have a big online section, mainly in German now, but will hopefully be developed into English. And that's to sort of preserve and pass on the knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, I was very lucky that at the conference, Hartmut was there with the little portfolio that he's actually going to release, I think this year, of a selection of upper patterns as pattern cards, actually. So because the Hartmut's book it's a tome. It's a reference book for those who are prepared to put the time into reading it as opposed to just needing the answer to a question. Whereas I think these upper cards are a little bit more sort of direct kind of thing. Obviously, Marcel Marchand in the States is publishing quite a lot.
Yeah, he has been involved in teaching in a lot of different ways, and now is quite important in the US for... Yeah,
absolutely.
Keeping the bespoke handmade shoemaking and other versions of handmade shoemaking alive, and getting in new people and so on.
I mean, I suspect at some point there's probably going to have to be a bit of a conversation about it and some conscious decisions made, because I think for a lot of shoemakers who have really interesting expertise to pass on, there was probably a period in Instagram's life where that made usable content and people pop stuff up there. Now the kind of algorithmic determination of what actually you get engagement from probably means that those sorts of things aren't as readily on the internet as they were. And so I think, while we're in a digital age where we as shoemakers, hopefully of younger generations and myself, are probably yet to grapple with how to make the best use of that. The digital kind of component will end up obviously being super important. The publishing kind of stuff, I think, is coming through, but probably, like you said, it's always been sort of like really significant texts of a generation, not necessarily sort of things which fulfill needs. More they cover the whole subject, so to speak. And I fear a little bit that learning from books while you don't have a basis in personal learning maybe is a little bit precarious. There will be certain people, someone like Dan Wigan is always going to be able to read a book and glean phenomenal bits of information from it because he has such a strong grounding.
Yeah, exactly.
Skills.
I mean, to only read a book and go from there, it's
asking a lot.
But to in conjunction with other types of learning and hopefully actual from other people, then you can gain a lot from it.
So I think, if I'm brutally honest, I would love to see the guilds in the UK have more of a role in this. I think the pattern makers do fantastic work in that regard, but they are very focused on orthopedics. And what they've supported, has been incredible. The cordwainers have had a very distinct focus that probably doesn't really deal with shoemaking very much. And I don't think it's any secret for anybody at the cordwainers that I wish it was a little bit more engaged with shoemaking. I know there are people who are really passionate about the subject who are involved, so there's always hope. But I think we probably need to start to look at new institutional frameworks.
All right, yeah, because if you look at the future now, and we talked a bit about it, but where and how do you, what would need to be done to continue, so not only to sort of save what we have, but to develop it?
It's a very good question, and it's very hard to answer because I think a lot of people have a lot of different opinions on the subject. I think there are certain people that think as long as the independent shoemakers get more work, that they'll be in a better position to potentially kind of fill some of that space. Some people, I think, are very happy to see like those private courses as sort of being responsible for it. And, both my professional and my political inclination probably makes me more disposed to seeing a more of an institutional response. I think when you talk about how the whole system works in France, it's really interesting.
Yeah.
There is a leather working group of guilds. My time at Capel, because it spread across both saddlery and shoemaking, I had a little bit of connection to that. I would love to see something like what the Warsaw Leather Skills Center is doing that actually goes beyond. I mean, obviously, as I've said, I'm hoping to develop some courses for that, but I'd like to see maybe more than one of those, one in the Midlands, one in London, and taking a bit of responsibility for it. I hope I still get invited to these events, because I think I've just asked these guilds to do something that thus far they haven't been able to.
Yeah.
But I think we don't have a great qualification system here.
No.
When I shared a space with Lena, I was really fascinated by him talking about his parents' development of that business and how his mum's the meister in that business.
Yeah,
his
exactly. And
dad's
you have the
isn't.
steps that you can you need to know and do this to get this, and then you can focus.
Absolutely.
Continue to get the next step and so on. We have in Sweden we have a little bit of that when it comes to the crafts world, but we don't have that much shoemaking around anymore.
Sure.
It's more for those sort of cobblers and other type of crafts, but it's still around, so to speak. And,
I know that the British Footwear Association are talking about like the looking at the apprenticeship system of qualification is an ongoing thing. I think for shoemakers in the world that we talk about, that apprenticeship system isn't necessarily very relevant. So I think at the moment our industry sort of is sat between a lot of different things and is probably still looking for a clear direction of travel for how to ensure not just skills survive, but the quality application of these skills. Because I think that's one of the things is it's, you can teach somebody how to make a shoe maybe in a fairly short space of time, but teaching them how to make a shoe well takes a very long time. I think I said it before, but for me, I was unprepared to call myself a shoemaker until I'd spent 10 years doing it professionally. And I think that still holds water. Whereas I think we're seeing a lot more kind of like people who are making beautiful looking shoes. And that's one aspect of it, but we don't really have a very strong ecology of ensuring dedication to craft and an accessibility of the necessary education to produce really high quality shoes. So it's a tricky one. It's a tricky one. And I think it's a question which is yet to find a definite answer. But my view probably lies in creating new institutional structures.
All right.
Of which I hope to be involved at some point.
We need people like you who are sort of really care for these things and want to spend time working for it, so to speak.
I think there's a lot of shoemakers who really care. I'm just not sure everyone always necessarily is able to find the time.
Exactly.
It's a competitive market we're all dealing with out there.
All right, Sebastian Tarek, thank you very much for being part of the Shoegazing podcast.
Thanks for coming by, Jesper.
Cheers. Thank you for listening in on this episode. If you enjoyed the podcast, please give it a good rating or comment in your podcast player. The Shoegazing podcast will be back with a new episode in a few weeks, so not that long of a wait this time. So hear you again soon.